George, welcome back to the Shared Practices podcast. How's it going?
Doing good, Richard. I think if there's ever an episode that was made for me, it's this one. So I'm excited to get into it.
I was so excited when I recorded it. I was like, George is going to freaking love this. So this was Dental Intel's president, Rob Bay. And I've met Rob a couple of times. I met him down in San Antonio at Breakaway because Dental Intel does a lot of work with Breakaway. And he really impressed me when he presented down there. And then he was later at Tuan Pham's Mavericks course. He presented there too. But just a guy who like lives in this, like understands at its core, like the numbers within a dental practice and how to tweak them and focus on them and improve them. And really, I felt like a pretty good educator too. Like he really had a great way of presenting the information to take something that could be very complex and overwhelming and be something digestible, not only in his presentation, but that's the whole point of the software. And that's, I kind of talk about that in the episode, but like, I feel like that's what we're trying to do in this podcast is create something that's intimidating and make it more approachable, and more able for the average dentist to use. They've literally built their entire business model around that. So I loved it. And he doesn't pull any punches. I feel like he went in pretty deep with some great information here.
Yeah. And, Richard, I want to add a couple points before we dive into the interview. Dental Intel, for those who don't know, they're a metric system. So what they do is they have software that goes into your practice management software and pulls like specific pieces of information that they're looking for. Yeah. And then they display it in a very convenient way with metrics that you should be tracking and, all of that. And they're not naturally in a situation where they analyze practices for purchase. It's something they do, but they're mainly for established business owners to help them run their practice better. Yeah. And so Richard does a great job in this interview of putting Rob in a unique situation of looking at a practice for sale and, trying to analyze what kind of things he'd be looking for. And that's what I really like about this interview is how Richard puts him in the situation of as a buyer versus a practice owner, which that's where he lives, 80, 90% of his life. So anyway, that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, I know for sure. And I think this dovetails really nicely. If you went back and listened to the Brady Frank episode, where he talks about potential in practices, and we can talk about this more in the outro, but he talks about how finding these practices with meat still on the bones that you can improve upon. And I feel like this interview gives real hard data and metrics and formulas for you to analyze potential in practices. So that's the preview we'll give, and we'll go straight to this interview with Rob Bay from Dental Intel. Okay, I have with me today Rob Bay, who is the co-founder and president of Dental Intel. Welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on, Rob.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to it.
Well, you fit right in with this show because you kind of have a thing for Excel, like Microsoft Excel. Is that true?
Yeah. I love math. I love Excel. And anytime, somebody who I know or a friend or somebody even who I've worked with in the past, if they ever get stumped in Excel, they always bring their Excel sheet to me or send it to me to solve it. And there's a huge, enormous, satisfying feeling for me in doing that. I don't know why, but I love it.
That's hilarious because it seems like, at some point you'd be like, oh, okay, I'm over this. You guys can solve your own Excel problems. But it's like, no, you legitimately like when people bring you their Excel problems. So that's pretty hilarious.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, well, for people who don't know what Dental Intel is, I'm going to try and describe it, and then you correct me because I'll probably screw it up a little bit. But Dental Intel, as far as I understand its full capacity, is a software platform that has a cloud-based component that will merge the financial data of a practice with the practice management data of the practice, take all of that data together, mash it up, calculate it, and pump out metrics that are actionable and they're based on what could be improved the most. So you guys have seen the financials and the practice data for hundreds of practices. You've analyzed them and you've been partners with people kind of like Breakaway and others that understand which metrics matter and which ones are kind of just nice to know about. And you've built this system of checking in with your numbers and making it very digestible, very easy to see. And you're like, okay, this month our case acceptance went down, or this month this number went down or up. And it gives you really specific, actionable data that otherwise you wouldn't have and you wouldn't be able to focus on it and work on. So is that a fair description of dental intel, and what would you change there?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And thank you so much for keying in on that part of actionable metrics and data and analytics. If you go back and look at, kind of the evolution of it, most people, when they think about data, they're thinking of it from a management perspective, like I'm the owner, I'm the manager, I'm looking at these things and seeing what's happening, and I'm waving my magic wand over my empire. But data has changed to where it's become so much more consumable, and you can use data in little chunks and little pieces for every single person in your practice. And when they have data that then tells them what to do today, or even specific patients that they need to take action on today, there's nothing. If you have 10 people in your practice, there's nothing that you can do as the owner of your practice that is more powerful than having 10 people that have data that's telling them one thing that they can do to make the practice better today, and them doing it and delivering it to them basically on a silver platter of, here's what you can do today to make the practice better. And we found that as the data becomes more and more consumable by the front desk person, by an assistant, by a hygienist, by each of those people, that practices are growing and growing and growing without the dentist even having to do very much, which really is the key.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And the thing that I love, I mean, I think about the alternative, which is you get your P&L and your financials back from your accountant every month, and you've got a whole ton of reports that you can run in your practice management software. And there's a ton of them. You can run all sorts of reports, but it's like, unless you run them and you know which ones to focus on and which ones to care about, that whole set of data doesn't merge itself and tell you what to do today. And Howard Ferran, he's been ranting about this forever. He's been like, why don't we have software that integrates our practice management and our accounting? Like, he just wants it all in one software. And you guys have said, well, sure, that's one option. Well, what about overlaying any accounting information with any practice management software? And I love the fact that, as I understand it, the reason that it's telling people what to do today is the metric will change, because if you get better at something, so say that it's, treatment plan presentation or case acceptance, or I don't, there's a ton of different metrics that you guys can present to focus on today. As you get better at that metric, you don't need to be focusing on that as much, because you've kind of built that skill. Now it shifts your attention to the next thing that you need improving upon. Is that kind of how it works?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's that component for sure, and there's definitely times, as you're saying, for a practice to use data in that managerial type of way, in terms of, here's what's happening, here's what's going on, here's what we need to do.
Sure.
But there's a lot of data that is not necessarily managerial in terms of this is what's going on and what's happening, but is really tactical in terms of, as an example, a hygienist that can look at her schedule today and say, these 5 patients have unscheduled treatment that are coming in. And those 5 patients, their unscheduled treatment equals $10,000.
Wow.
And I can see that the dentist has time available on their schedule this time. I need to make sure that I communicate this to the dentist about these 5 patients, and that the dentist, when he comes in, we have enough time to make sure to do a good exam, and that we're poised and prepared to be able to take action. Or additionally, of my 8 patients that are coming in, 3 of them have family members that are unscheduled. And here's who they are. It's Mary and Susie and Johnny. And those 3 people, when they're here, I'm going to make sure, as I'm rescheduling them, that I'm going to offer to schedule their family members, and here's who they are, and here's what their names are.
That's awesome.
I mean, there's a lot of things like that I'm saying, that are tactical, that if you hand it to that person about, here's something that you can do today, they'll act on it. And when they do, your practice is getting better without you even having to do anything for it.
No, and that's the key, and that's I feel like systemization is one thing, systems that you have to implement and be the creator of, that's one thing, and then automation is the next level of that systemization. So you've taken this and made it automated, and it's a system, and your whole team can access it. So it's not having to come down from the dentist, from the practice manager. They're able to see that, to track that, and get feedback on their own performance and what's possible and direction on what's possible. So cool. Well, I think we've given our listeners a pretty good idea of the power of this. And I love that you're willing to come on and do this show, because I really like the perspective of people who maybe aren't directly involved in acquisitions, but you see the financial results of them, and you have a large data set. You've done this for many, many practices, and you've helped others acquire practices. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, we work with a lot of regular dentists, and as they're going out and buying practices, helping them to analyze and look at the data. And then obviously once they purchase those practices, make them better and know how to see what's happening and what to do. But also we have a large customer base of DSOs. And man, as they go out and look at acquiring practices, it's really accelerated that process for them in knowing where the best opportunities are. They can get a lot of due diligence done in a very quick and timely way, where most of the time, as you go and you're trying to find out data and information about practices, it's difficult to get back true and accurate data.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And as far as I understand, I think is Breakaway use you guys as they're picking up practices over time, or are you allowed to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of partners that we work with in that way, and Breakaway is one of them. They're definitely one of our key partners that we work with in that way. Okay.
And I don't want to offer this if this isn't something that you do very routinely, but so if one of our listeners knows hey, I've heard about Dental Intel, I want to use them once I am a practice owner, I'm an associate right now, I'm looking for practices, could they reach out to you and say, hey, I know I'm going to use you guys once I'm in practice. Can you guys help me look at some of these practices? I don't know if that's something that you have enough personnel and ability to take on or not.
I'm laughing a little bit here. I love it. It's a little brave of you, and I like it, because normally we do that for people who are already our customers and going out and acquiring offices. But yes,
additional practices.
If they listen to this webinar or to this podcast, and they call me up and they say, hey, I was listening to this podcast, and you and Richard said that you would do this, then we'll do that. Yeah, we will help them evaluate those practices, and then obviously we want them to utilize us once they do.
Awesome. I appreciate that. I know I think it was when we were having lunch down at Breakaway, you mentioned that that's something that you don't typically do for everyone, and so I was hesitant to ask, so that I really appreciate you offering that to our audience. So
no problem.
Okay, cool. Well, moving on to kind of the next phase of this episode, we were talking about kind of the formula and the understanding of what makes a practice successful, because if we can understand that, then we can find practices that are successful to acquire, and then we'll look at how to evaluate that practice's potential. So talk to me about how you see the financials of practice and what makes practices successful.
Awesome. There is a mathematical formula that equals the success in a dental practice.
Okay.
And there are 4 components to it. Every single thing that happens in a dental practice it comes into play with one of these 4 variables in the practice. And the formula is basically A times B times C minus D equals profits. And let me tell you what each of these A, B, C, D are. The very first thing we got to look at is how many visits do you have in the practice, whether that's a week, a month, a year, any type of time frame. How many visits do you see?
Okay.
We're going to multiply that by how much you're producing per visit. Now, that's A and B. Those 2 things multiplied together actually equals your production. But production itself, while it's good to know, it's not a very good metric to look at on its own, because there's nothing inherent about it that tells you what to do.
Sure.
But if we start to break it down into those components of how many visits do we have and how much are we producing per visit, then we can start to see, is our issue a quantitative problem or is it a qualitative problem?
Okay.
And then you address those in two totally different ways.
So do we need more visits or more productive visits?
Yeah. Do we need more visits, or do we need to produce more when they're here, or do we need a combination of the two?
Okay.
So the third component is we're going to multiply first visits times production per visit. Then we're going to multiply that by our collection percentage. And this is telling us what percentage of that production then are we collecting. From that, we're going to then subtract our overhead, and that gives us our total profitability.
Okay.
So if we think of each of those kind of like as a knob or a lever, and if I was a dentist and I was measuring my practice rather than just looking at production, collections, and new patients, these would be the four starting points of where I would look at. And so from a visit standpoint, we need to know what our capacity is and where we're at in relation to our capacity. And because a lot of times we see practices that they want to grow, and they don't necessarily realize that they're at their capacity, and they need to either determine if they're going to expand capacity or figure out how to produce more per visit.
Okay. So let me stop you here, because I have a question. How would, if I'm looking at a practice and, maybe I'm talking with a broker and they've sent me over a few things, P&L, prospectus, I'm assuming the number of visits, I feel like I haven't seen that reported in any of that information that I've seen from practices I've looked at and people have shared with me. What would they have to run? Like, they would have to run a report in their practice management software? Would that be pretty easy to ask for?
Yes, it's a report that you can pull out of your practice management software. I mean, we obviously have it within Dental Intel,
Sure,
where it's easy, and I can't remember the name of that report right off the top of my head.
Okay.
And it depends on the practice management software that you
right.
have.
Dentrix or EagleSoft or Open Dental.
But
yeah.
that number is a number you can get out. Now,
Okay.
The number that you can't get out is how much you're producing per visit. And so the way that you'd calculate that is you take your total production, gross production,
right,
and you're going to then divide that by how many visits once you pull that number out, and that will give you what that number is of your production per visit. And
Interesting.
when you're looking at that number, a typical average office will be about 250, 275, right
Okay.
around there.
That's production per visit?
Per visit, exactly. And that's including all visits. That's including, doctor visits, hygiene visits, no fee visits, and any of those types of visits.
250 to 275 is kind of like a nationwide average.
Yeah. If you're doing well, you're going to be over 400, and we have customers that are over 1,000 in that number, in that statistic. And so you want to know, where you're at, because I mean, that's an indicator to you of, is there potential in this practice? Is what's there repeatable? Because for me, if I was buying a practice and they were at $1,000 per visit, and I was a new grad, I would be very leery of that practice, because the likelihood of that being repeatable for you is very low.
Sure.
So we want to start looking at it from that perspective. How many visits do we have? How much are we producing per visit? Our collection percentage, and then subtract from that our overhead to get our overall profitability. If you know and understand that, then it starts to become easier to make those evaluations.
Well, I feel like it would also maybe just give you a sense of, so if they gave you 2016's tax information and all of the breakdown of their overhead, and then you got the number of visits, you'd kind of just have a feel for how busy, how on roller skates you would be in this office. If you have a ton of visits and it's a low production per visit, that you're just hopping from patient to patient, and that would just be a good indicator of the practice style almost in a way, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And not, like you're saying, not always is more better. There's a practice in particular that I was looking at the data of this practice and what happened over a period of time. Somebody came in and purchased this practice, and I kind of watched what happened after the fact. This was somebody who was using our data before, but not necessarily after. So I got an idea of what happened before, and then what happened afterwards. So this was a practice that during this period of time that the new owner had purchased this practice, they increased the number of visits, and they increased the number of visits by 100 more visits per month.
Okay.
Now, also during that time frame, their production increased, but their production increased by $9,000. Okay. Now, what that means is on all those additional visits, they increased those visits by essentially an average of $90
per
visit.
They're like losing money on these visits.
Absolutely. And so them getting more busy, it only made them. I mean, obviously they're going to be making a little bit of money, but they've got a whole lot of headache.
That's awful
for that small gain, for that small improvement. So you got to look at it from the whole picture.
As some of you may know, the opportunity to join Richard on this podcast came abruptly. We had been friends for a while, but I never thought about the idea of actually being a co-host to the podcast. One of the best examples of this is a post that I made on Dentaltown less than 2 weeks before I joined Richard. In the post, I talk about my frustration with podcasts as a listener. I never felt like I could get enough information out of them. And one of my missions when I joined was to create episodes that I would want to listen to. I talked about this a little bit in the outro of Tanner's episodes. I wanted them to be packed with actionable information that can apply to your life and actually improve it. The feedback I had gotten since I came on has been pretty unreal. But one thing I keep hearing over and over again is that despite our best efforts, people are just not able to apply all the information. I feel like the podcast medium makes it difficult to get across dense information. It's listened to passively, and it's hard to take notes when you're driving or doing something around the house. That's why, since I've come on, we've tried to add episode resources and create a place for discussion on our Facebook group. Ultimately, this challenge is exactly why I'm so excited for the Ownership Accelerator. It's my opportunity to fix everything that is wrong with the podcasting medium in my eyes. It's my opportunity to really explain things thoroughly in a format that is more appropriate for the type of information that we're trying to convey. With hours of lecture, a thorough handbook, worksheets, Excel files, and checklists, we're able to really provide everything you need to successfully enter practice ownership and buy a practice. I teamed up with Paul Goodman and a great group of experts to ensure every topic in the course is covered thoroughly by a professional. Trust me, you are not going to want to miss out on this course. As a thank you to our loyal audience, we are going to be offering an exclusive discount for the first 50 people to sign up on our waiting list. Click on the link in the description below and sign up on the waiting list for access to the discount and first access to the course. We could not be happier with the way it's turned out, and I know that you guys are just going to love it.
Wow. Okay. Well, and knowing where the practice was and where you're going, it seems like that metric gives you something to focus on, both comparing practices and then once you get into the practice saying, okay, we're doing a lot of visits. Let's see if we can make these visits more productive. Or, we have productive visits. Let's see if we can get more of them.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, and let's say you purchased a practice, and this practice did $750,000 in production, and let's say that equaled 3,000 visits in the year, and they're $250 per visit, their average. So that's 750,000. And let's say an average in collection percentage when we're talking about gross is right around 85%. So I mean, our collections will definitely be less than that, but let's use that number of 85%, and then from that, then you have your overhead of whatever your overhead may be. In that type of practice, you're probably looking at something around an average practice, by the way, is about 72% overhead, but let's say it's 70% overhead. From there, though, you could kind of draw out what you want this to look like in terms of saying, okay, if I increase this from 3,000 to 4,000, and maybe that's something that you want to do, or maybe not. And what's that going to mean for me from a busyness perspective? And if I can increase my production per visit from 250 to even to 300.
Right.
That takes that practice from 750,000 to 1.2 million worth of production. And if I can improve a little bit on how much, what percentage of that I'm collecting, all of those things compound on each other. And then once you get over to the overhead standpoint, it really starts to compound because of what's going on with fixed costs. And I mean, we can talk about how that plays in, but you can kind of plan it out in terms of where you expect it to be, and then go put a plan in place to go get it, instead of just jumping in there and saying, "Okay, I'm just going to work my butt off and hope that this gets better."
Well, and we'll get into that, because I think you've got some interesting stuff. I'm excited to hear about the potential of the practice and calculating what the profit will be once you've maximized that potential. So let's get there, but let's start a few steps back then. You talk about evaluating practices as in terms of their potential. And we've talked about this in the podcast before, and this is something we're a big believer in. A broker, when they're evaluating a practice, like Matt Porter talked about in his episodes, he said a broker is not allowed to use the potential of the practice. They have to use the current snapshot of the practice, because that's what it's currently worth. But if we want to extract the most value out of these practices, we have to understand that potential. So you have a way of looking at capacity of the practice from multiple perspectives. Describe for us real quick some of those perspectives, or maybe let's just start with the physical capacity, because I like that, and I want to go a little bit deeper into this.
Awesome. So when you look at, there are a lot of ways. There's from the physical capacity standpoint, from the patient standpoint, and then also from the human capabilities of you and your team.
Okay.
So when you start and you're looking from the physical capacity standpoint, there's a really super simple, easy formula to look at what you can normally expect from a practice that's performing. And you want to take the number of operatories, multiply that by the how many regular 8-hour days that practice is open.
Okay.
So let's take a number, for example, let's say this practice has 5 operatories.
Okay.
And let's say you're planning on being open 4 days a week.
Sure.
We're going to take 5 times 4 is 20. And then we're going to multiply that by a number which is 75,000. That's a constant that we're going to use. We're going to take 20 and multiply it by 75,000, and that tells us that we have a capacity basically of 1.5 million. If we're doing 1.5 million in that practice from a physical capacity standpoint, we're doing well. I mean, we're maximizing what's there.
Okay.
Now,
and this is interesting. So I'm just trying to digest this in my brain, and because it's an audio format, me trying to like figure this out might help some people. So
sure.
5 operatories, 4 days a week is like 20 operatory days is like the units of measurement we could call that.
Yes.
Per week. And then you're multiplying that by this 75,000. Where does that come from? $75,000 per operatory day time. That's like, over the course of 52 weeks in a year, that's the potential production of each chair for every day that it's being used.
Basically, yes. And where it comes from is, we have thousands and thousands of providers that utilize our data.
Okay.
And so we spend a lot of time looking and analyzing what we see and what's going on to find correlations, and where practices are doing well, and what's average, and what's struggling, and what is the difference between them. We're always looking for those little nuances of what the difference is, or what's the correlation. And what we found is if we look at it from that perspective of they have 5 operatories, they're there 4 days a week, operatories times days a week, and that constant number of 75,000, if they're doing well, that is really what they can expect out of that office from a physical capacity standpoint. Now, you also want to calculate where they're at in terms of capacity.
Okay.
How well are they utilizing their capacity? And because an average office operates from a physical capacity standpoint, I'm not going to talking about dollars. I'm just saying just the utilization of their chair time is at 51%, and that's during the time that they're open. And the way that you calculate this is a little bit more complex, and so I'll take it slow and we'll walk this through.
Wait, let me before we go there, I want to ask one more question because maybe some of our listeners are thinking the same thing. So going back to that operatories and days, this is a very broad average because I'm thinking about like, well, what if it was, 2 docs in a practice versus 1 doc and 4 hygienists, 2 docs and 2 hygienists, or, I was thinking about each chair, like what is it being dedicated to influences, that number, but you're taking a very, very broad average of what this practice could be overall. And that's that 75,000.
Yep. If you're a general dentist and you're doing some additional things,
okay,
not necessarily saying that you're doing everything, but maybe you do a little bit of ortho, or you do a little bit of endo, or you do some implants, or you do some of this, something,
some pedo, something,
or whatever, some additional component that's normally what you can expect. Now, if you're using 2 docs and you're there 12 hours a day, I would consider, and you're there 4 days a week, I'd consider that to be 6 days. So we'd take 5 times 4 that are essentially day and a halves,
sure,
right? So we'd take 5 times 6, it'd be 30. Then we'd multiply that by that number. We'd be looking at about 2.25 million.
Okay.
In that situation, so you'd want to look at that and take that into consideration. So it's just a real quick and dirty way of saying, what can I get to based upon what's here from an operatory and a day standpoint.
Awesome.
And obviously you have 7 days available, and if you ran it 24 hours a day, you essentially have 21 days available. And so the next question is how much time am I actually willing to put into it,
right?
To be able, and can I get to where I want to within that time frame?
Well, and this is like I love this quick and dirty metric because in a recent episode we talked with Dr. Brady Frank. I don't know if you've ever met him, but he has some pretty brilliant group models. And one of the things that he looks at is value-added practices. He's trying to find practices that they know they can scale and grow and buy them at a much lower price. And his biggest thing is the number of operatories, because he knows he can grow and scale a practice. If it has more operatories, he can grow and scale it. So now you've kind of unlocked a number for people to play with, so that they can evaluate, okay, this has this many operatories, and I'm willing to put in this many days or get it running this many days between me and a partner or me and an associate, and knowing its potential. So, okay, I love that number. We'll move on to the 51%. So describe for me the 51% again.
So you want to look at
this was the actual utilization of a chair. So you're saying when it comes down to it, our chairs are wasted half the time. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Okay.
Now,
the way that you want to look at this and you want to measure it, and again, I'm going based upon the number of practices that we have their data and how we've spent so much time poring over this. The best way to look at capacity is in the hygiene. And what I'm saying, when they're at 51% capacity, I'm talking about 51% capacity within hygiene. And the reason why in hygiene is because it really is the fuel
that
drives everything else, because there's something magic that happens in that hygiene appointment, and it's the hygienist comes in and taps the dentist on the shoulder and says, I need you to come in for an exam.
Yeah.
And that is what kicks off and drives everything that creates success in the dental office. And so this is a very important aspect. And when you're talking about capacity, there's no better way of looking at it than looking at it from the perspective of the capacity within hygiene. And here's how you calculate this. Again, we're going to look at how many chairs do we have dedicated to hygiene.
Okay.
We're then going to take that and we're going to multiply that by how many hygiene days a week that we're there. And so we may say, okay, this is a 5 operatory practice, the one that we talked about. And so we say, okay, 2 of those operatories are for hygiene.
Okay.
And we're there 4 days a week. 2 times 4 is 8. I'm then going to multiply that by how many hours a day that I'm there. Okay. And so let's say they're regular 8-hour days, and then we can look at the scenario of the 12-hour days. We know with the two doctors.
Sure.
But we say we've got 8, and we're there 8 hours a day, so now we're at 64.
Okay.
Now we're going to multiply that by 4 weeks in a month. The actual is actually 4.2, but we'll say 4, and that gives us 256.
Okay.
Now there's the very last component is a little bit tricky, but it's simple. We're going to multiply it by 60 minutes, and we're going to then divide it by how many minutes we actually take for a hygiene appointment. Most of the time we see that 60, and so that's a net 1. 60 over 60 is 1. But if you have a shorter hygiene appointment, if you have for example, a 45-minute hygiene appointment, we're going to multiply by 60, divide by 45, which then is going to give us a coefficient basically of a 1.1 1/3. So that number 256 is going to increase by 1/3. Or if we take longer in our hygiene visit, then our capacity is going to decrease. You want to measure and calculate what your capacity is, and then compare that with how many hygiene visits do you actually have. Because if we can increase the quantity of our hygiene visits, what that is going to mean is that we're having that many more exams, and there's that many more essentially at-bats or opportunities for driving restorative production.
So this kind of, so we did chairs dedicated to hygiene times hygiene days times hours we're doing hygiene times weeks in a month times months in a year. So, and then
we don't even need to take it necessarily to a year. Most of the time, it's easiest to look at this from a month perspective.
Okay, and then correct for how long your hygiene visits actually take. And this is essentially this number. Like we ended up with the 256, and we're calling it 60 over 60 if we have a 60-minute appointment. That's the number of exams possible.
Okay. Exactly. And then you want to calculate how many are actually happening. And you can look at that either in terms of how many hygiene visits are happening or how many exams did we do in the month, and see where you're at in relation to that. You want to be as close to capacity as you can, which tells you that you're utilizing your time as best as you possibly can. If you're not at capacity in this number, if you're a typical practice and you're at 51% capacity, that tells you essentially you could double your practice from a production standpoint by improving this number, assuming then that you also had the time on the doctor's side to be able to then do the treatments that you're diagnosing.
Okay.
But most practices are way underperforming in this number, which then leads you to want to look at, can we fill the capacity? Is it possible to fill it?
And I'm assuming, it's a combination of missed appointments and unfilled blocks of time. What percentage is realistic? I feel like not every time will the doc be doing an exam on every patient, because there's some patients that just clean bill of health. They just come in for their cleaning, and you come in and say hi, or once a year, and then they come in for their other cleaning. Are we truly shooting for like 100% of these potential hygiene visits that we're going in, or what is a realistic number?
So a realistic number, there's different things that you have to take into consideration. One thing to consider is no matter how awesome you are, you're going to have patients that no-show and cancel.
Sure.
And so even if you're scheduled to 100%, you're likely not to be operating at 100% when the day is all said and done.
Right.
And then again, like you say, not all of those patients are you going to be doing exams on. That aspect of what percentage of those are you going to be doing exams on is, I don't pretend to tell a dentist, how to diagnose.
Sure.
And so that's something where there's a little bit more play. But when you're looking at what percentage are we actually able to have a hygiene appointment where somebody who actually shows and they're here in the chair, you want to be at 93% or better.
Okay. So the 51% is like the people who aren't paying attention to this is where they're at. The people who are focusing on this and really maximizing it can get it up to something like 90 in the 90s, low 90s is a great place to be at for this.
Absolutely. If you're doing that, you're doing well on this number.
Okay, interesting.
So when you're looking at a practice and you're seeing, okay, this practice is producing X, but they're limited in how many I want to be able to grow this practice and make it more valuable than what it is and have it produce more income than what it has been producing.
Yeah.
Here's a place to look and see, okay, are they really being able to maximize that time or that chair space? And then if they're not, why? And if they're not, how can I then fill it? Do we have the patience actually even to be able to do it?
A word from our sponsor, Q Optics. Does anyone remember the case from the iPhone 3? I think it was 3S or 3G, whatever it was. And then also the old Galaxy S, Samsung Galaxy S. They were thick, bulky, black cases. And they weighed a little bit more. And they weren't so sleek. When I look around at a lot of loupes, that's what I see. I see these big, bulky cases holding the optics. And actually, when you look through the loupes, you get a little frame. As you look through the little telescopes, you can see this black outline. And you get used to it. It's normal because you're using them all the time. But I never realized how much that frame took up until I tried on one of the pairs of Q Optics prismatic loupes. I remember we were at Buca di Beppo, the Italian restaurant where they had given their presentation, and I put on the frame, and all I could see was these two perfect little circles of magnification without a black circle or an outline surrounding the optics. I could just see around the long telescopes without those taking up another portion of my field of view. Q Optics has taken a solid titanium unibody case with a carbon shroud encircling the lenses, and they've made it smaller, more lightweight, less in the way. If you're sick of wearing loupes around that look like they have a iPhone 3 case on them, that look kind of dorky, and you want something that actually looks good and allows you to see around it, you should try out Q Optics. Give them an email at sales@q-optics.com. Use the promo code SP16 for $100 off your pair of loupes or $300 off your loupes and light combo. If you upgrade your smartphone when they come out with a better looking, better functioning, more lightweight version, why wouldn't you do the same with your loupes? Q Optics, making better loupes. Right. Okay. And one thing I was going to ask, it seems like you could, and I'll come back to that patient question because I think that's going to lead us into the next segment. This number of exams done, it seems like you could probably then tag on the next set of metrics once you're actually in the practice of what do we end up average treatment planning and presenting to patients per exam, and then what percentage actually accept and follow through with treatment. And then there's two more dials that we can play with and see, are we leaving things on the table?
There's actually four dials here.
Okay.
At this point, once you've given an exam, there's four things, and we'll run them in sequence. Okay. So once you've given an exam, you want to measure what percentage of the time am I diagnosing that there's something that needs to be done.
Okay.
And an average, and again, I don't pretend to tell a dentist how to diagnose, but an average practice, we see this number at about 25% of the time they do an exam. They see a patient, they're diagnosing that there's something that needs to be done.
Okay.
Practices that we see that perform at the 90th percentile, that number is about 42%.
Okay.
42% of the patients. And again, I'm not telling a dentist how to diagnose. I'm just telling you what we see statistically.
Sure.
Then once you diagnose, you want to measure what percentage of the patients are accepting something.
Okay.
Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're accepting everything. You may present a treatment plan that was $50,000 and they accepted $100. I'm counting that as a yes. What percentage of the patients accepted something? And by accepting, I mean they either did it that day or they scheduled to do it.
Okay.
Then you want to measure, on average, what is the dollar amount that is being presented to those patients. And then the fourth dial is what percentage of that dollar amount is being accepted. And so we may say, okay, I saw this one patient, I diagnosed them, then they accepted treatment. I presented $50,000 to them. They accepted, let's say $1,000, so they accepted 2% of what it was that I presented to them.
Sure.
And so you want to watch that all all the way through that process. And especially if you are a dentist that's going to acquire a practice and you know what your numbers are, and you're acquiring a practice of a similar, let's say a similar demographic, you could then overlay what you're doing in that practice. And you may see, okay, this practice, on average, they're diagnosing 25% of their patients, but I've been trending around 30. And they're getting, 50% of their patients to accept, but I'm about 65%. And you could lay that right over the top, and then you could then project what you will be able to do in that practice as compared to the prior dentist. And that's especially applicable when you find a practice that's underperforming in that aspect in terms of what they're doing on the doctor side of things, which is a lot of practices. It's most practices.
Sure. Well, and this is awesome. The question, my mind is going to next, if they were already plugged into Dental Intel, it'd be great. They'd already have all this data. If they're an associate at an office that doesn't have Dental Intel, maybe they could convince them to get Dental Intel, but maybe they can't. At that point, they could
try and calculate
this
data otherwise.
Yeah.
The only way without Dental Intel really is to just track it manually.
Okay.
And I know that that's kind of a pain.
Excel spreadsheets right there. We just pull out Excel.
Yeah, but if that's your only way of doing it, it would be worthwhile.
Yeah, to have that data.
Not only will you know what your performance is, and then you can overlay it on whatever practice you go to purchase, but when you start to measure those things,
you'll start improving.
Just the fact of measuring it, you're going to be improving it. Yeah. Exactly.
No, that's awesome. I think that's a great tip. So, I mean, that right there is going to be helpful. If someone has the discipline to track this and look at this for themselves, they're going to improve in their own performance, and they're going to improve in their ability to evaluate practices. So it's really a double whammy. If you're looking for a practice to acquire, this is doing double the work for you. So that's awesome. That's a great takeaway for our audience.
Now, especially if you're an associate and you get paid based on a percentage of your production, let me lay something out for you. An average practice is 25% of your patients that you diagnose with treatment. 52% of those patients will accept treatment, and they will accept 30% of the dollar amount that you present to them. Now, you can get a 10% improvement in each of those metrics, meaning we go from 25 to 35, from 52 to 62, and from 30 to 40. Now, that's not even top performing, because top performing is 42%, 71%, and 50%.
Okay, so that's reasonable to try and have that 10% improvement in each area.
Yeah, it's halfway between average and performing. If you can do a 10% improvement in each of those areas, it will increase your production by 123%. Huh. So if you're paid on production, if you want to, even if you don't get 10% improvement in each one, 5% here, 4% there, 3% here, what that will do for you in terms of your personal production and your income will be huge. Just that alone makes it worth measuring those numbers.
Awesome. Okay, cool. This has been really good. Let's dive into the next one, because I'm worried that we've like gone deep on these things, and I've loved them. And I know there's so much more that we can talk about. So we talked about patient potential. So then it's kind of the patient pool that you're buying into. Number of active patients. So how do you evaluate that patient potential when looking at a potential practice?
Okay, perfect. You want to look at and see how many active patients that they have.
Okay.
Now, active patients to a lot of people can mean a lot of different things. But the way that we look at active patients, and the way that I'm going to reference an active patient, is this. It's somebody who's been in the practice in the last 18 months and they had ledger activity.
So they've paid for something in the last 18 months. They paid
for something in the last 18 months. They came in the practice and they had something where they had ledger activity where they owed money, whether they paid for it or not.
Okay, fair enough.
So once you look at what that number is, there's again, I'm going to give you some constants that you want to compare that to. Yeah, and the way that you can figure out what that constant is you can take the total production in that practice and divide it by the number of active patients. And this is an annual production. And so now this is telling us how much are we going to produce on average per patient annually. An average practice is right around about $520. Okay. If you're performing, then you'll be right around $900. So you can take some variable within that range and multiply it by how many active patients they have. And so if they have, let's say, 2,000 active patients, and you feel like, okay, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to implement some systems and I'm going to measure these things, and because of that, I'm going to be able to produce at a top level per active patient, which most people can if they're actively engaged in measuring and looking at and then taking action on data.
Right.
Then you want to use that number of $900. And so 2,000 patients times $900 would be $1.8 million in production. Okay. Now, that practice is likely operating around average of 520. And so if you had 2,000 patients, that would tell you that practice is producing, right around $1 million. And so there's about $800,000 in unlocked potential within that practice. And then then we want to go to again about why is that? Is it because we have those patients, we're just not seeing them frequently enough, meaning visits, we're not having enough visits from those patients, or when they come, are we not producing enough per visit from those patients? And so if we start to look at this from a few different perspectives, it becomes obvious what the path forward is to be able to reach the potential of the practice. And we can see, okay, from a physical capacity, this practice has a potential of $1.5 million. From a patient perspective, it has a potential of $1.8 million. If from a patient perspective, it has more potential than from a physical perspective, you've got
a days of chair operation capacity bottleneck.
Yeah. Means, do we want to expand capacity a little bit to be able to account for it? Or do we want to be more selective with our patients? Or are we going to factor in that we're going to be losing a small percentage of those patients, and where will that leave us in relation to our physical capacity? And then once we start to look at the numbers that we looked at before from a physical capacity, as we look at it at hygiene, that's starting to tell us if we're not having enough visits. Or is it because when we look at our production and we divide it by the number of visits, is it because how much we're producing per visit? Are we under an average number of 250, 275? Or we feel like we can get that number to 400 or better and beyond, and is that why we're not reaching our capacity? Our potential. So those will start to help you to determine what's the potential and how can I then get that practice to its potential. The last thing that you want is to buy a practice where it's operating at or beyond its potential. Okay. Because what that is telling you
you're paying top dollar for this production.
Yeah, you're paying top dollar for that practice, and it's the best that it's going to be. Or you're buying a practice, and I've seen this a lot of times as well by people that didn't realize they buy a practice that's running a 4-minute mile, but they can only run 8-minute miles. And so they buy a practice that was doing $1.8 million, and they bring it down to $800,000. And they paid the dollars of what it would be to buy that practice at $1.8 million, and they brought it down to $800,000. They'd have been a lot better off buying a practice that was doing $400,000 that they could take to $800,000. And it would have cost them, a quarter of the price, and their end result was the exact same.
Interesting. This is awesome. I feel like these are some powerful tools that people can use to evaluate, okay, where are the bottlenecks? What can I do in this if I were to plug into this practice? And is this worth it for me? Which is kind of the driving home. I love the overlap between episodes. Hunter Smith talked about what is the practice with the most repeatable production that I can walk in. I know I can do that. And to buy the practice kind of doing that highest production that you can do and repeat yourself. You don't want to do something that you can't repeat. And so you're driving that point home as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that to look at, and data becomes such an important aspect in looking at and evaluating and determining if this is a good buy. If your reason for purchasing a practice is because, oh, I like this location and the equipment is new and and the people there are nice, those are all components. But if that's not a practice that has some real potential that you can then improve upon, you're overspending for that practice, and you got to determine if that's worth it to you or not.
Okay. I think we've got about 10 minutes left, and there's two topics that you mentioned before the show that we could talk about, and I want to see if we can hit them because this has been really good. You talked about the financial potential of a practice and the break-even point, and then calculating. So say that, here's our fixed costs, here's our variable costs, and here's our potential. What is the financial benefit, production, take home going to look like at capacity versus where is it at now? How do you look at that, and what do you plug into that?
Okay, this topic is really fun to me because people get into dentistry because they want to make money. You can talk about all the altruistic reasons, but it's a major reason and component why people go into dentistry. It's a great,
and I would be lying,
great living. It's a great income.
If I didn't say that was definitely a large portion of why I looked into this career over other careers where I could help people.
Now, there's two things that you need to consider as a dentist. One is you make money as a practitioner, as a clinician, and there is a finite quantity of money that you can make in being a clinician. You also make money in being a proprietor of a dental practice. And the quantity of money that you can make in being a proprietor of a dental practice can be as much or more than what you make in being a dentist as a clinician. And if you're paying attention to these things, it literally can mean $5-10 million more to you in income over your lifetime of practicing by being good at these things and understanding them. So one thing to understand in a practice is that most practices do not operate at capacity. They are operating at a level that is then becomes comfortable for that dentist, which normally is just barely beyond a break-even point.
Right.
So and that's why I say an average practice has 72% overhead. They're 28% profitable, where the dentist is the one who owns the practice and is working in the practice, a single dentist. And that number, by the way, is being eroded 1% annually, has been for the last 15 years, the percentage of what the profitability is in a practice.
Oh.
But if a dentist will realize that once they're beyond their break-even point, they can really drive that last number down. We talk about visits, production per visit, collection percentage, overhead. Overhead, when you're looking at it, it's not necessarily that we're cutting overhead, that we're going to go cut costs and we're going to spend less money. Overhead, it only matters when you're looking at it in relation to the percentage of your collections.
Okay.
And so the best way to solve an overhead issue in most situations is not to cut costs, but to be able to increase our production and our collections. Once we do, if we can calculate, okay, this practice is not operating at capacity, it's not operating at its potential, and it's producing this much income. What we want to then be able to do is see if I can make it reach potential based upon my numbers that I already know that I can do, and if I go overlay that in this practice, what will this create for me in terms of income? Once you're beyond that break-even point, the only additional costs that are going to increase your overhead are your variable costs, which isn't your facility. It's not your team members. It's not any of those other things that all fall under that category of those fixed expenses. It's just the variable costs, which in most cases for most people are your lab and your supplies and your other consumables. And that typically in a practice is is right around 15%, or maybe even maybe a little bit less than that.
Huh.
Which means that if you can increase the overall collections in a practice by $100,000, which honestly is very easy for it to do in most every practice,
Okay.
it will produce $85,000 more in income.
So and
almost all of that is then going to be going to your own pocketbook.
Right. And this is to rephrase this is the break even point is all those fixed costs that you talked about of staff, overhead, keeping the lights on, paying all the bills. This extra work that you've put in for this extra $100,000 is not that much more work compared to the overall work, but because you've cracked that nut of your core costs,
right,
you're taking home 85% of this rather than the 35% or the 25% that you did of that previous amount that you made up to this point.
Absolutely. And if you'll remember earlier, I said we look at these practices and we see the practices that are average, that underperform, and that perform. And honestly, the difference between them is very subtle. It's very, very small. We just have a few more visits. We're just producing a little bit more in our production per visit. And we're just collecting a little bit more and collecting it sooner. And those things, they compound on top of each other.
Sure.
And so it drives that ultimate number of the profitability. When you look at the overhead, I hate to say it's more of a static number, but we want to look at it a little bit more in terms of a static number when you're looking at it from a dollar perspective. But we want to drive down that number from a percentage standpoint, and the way that we do that is increasing those other things. And so if we look at a scenario that you bought a practice that was that let's say you bought a practice that collected $700,000.
Okay.
And let's say it had an average overhead. We'll use 70% to make it easy. So our overhead's $490,000, and the income that spins out is $210,000. That's pre-acquisition.
Okay.
Okay. Now let's say that we determine that the potential of this practice is significantly higher. It's one of the ones we were talking about, somewhere between 1.5 from a physical standpoint,
sure,
or 1.8 from a patient standpoint. But let's say we feel like we can get this practice to $1 million.
Okay.
Okay, so we're not going to necessarily rocket it all the way up to its top potential, but we're
not doubling. It's like 300,000. A modest 40% type increase.
Yeah, we're going to make this practice better. And the way that we're going to do it is we're going to increase our visits, just by a little. We're going to produce just a little bit more per visit, and we're going to collect our money a little bit sooner and a little bit higher percentage of it. Okay?
Okay.
So that's what we're doing. Now, essentially we're increasing our collections by 300,000. Now, by increasing our collections 300,000, only 15% of that is going to be additional expense. And so 45,000 of that $300,000 is going to be cost, which then means the difference, which is 255,000, is going to be additional income. So by increasing that practice from 700,000 to $1 million in collections, we have more than doubled our income. We've taken our income from 210,000 to 465,000. And so when you look at that in relation to everything else that we've talked about in determining, here's what this practice does, here's what the potential is for the practice, here's what I feel like that we can do in making this practice better by increasing in these few little components, and then ultimately what that's going to do for me, those small little improvements are going to take that practice and what used to be a $210,000 income and turn it into a $465,000 income. It becomes very real and very realistic for a dentist to do that.
So I am so excited right here because you've just crystallized something that I haven't been able to fully express about practice ownership that's different from being an associate. And that is that one of the reasons that ownership is awesome is that if you get past this break-even point and get into this, we've paid all of our major bills, now we just have our variable expenses, your reward for doing dentistry jumped from the 25, 30% as an owner initially, or as an associate doing that production. Now your reward for doing that dentistry is up to 60, 70% potentially, maybe even more. And so your return on your effort for that extra effort is so much higher as an owner than it is as an associate. And so this explains a lot of why of the financial benefit of ownership. And I've been trying to articulate that in season 1. We've talked about it in other aspects, but this really drives it home for me, and it gives me a better way to talk about this. So thank you for breaking that down. That really was a light bulb moment for me.
Yeah, think about it this way. If you work as an associate, you're normally making, let's say, 30% of collections.
Yeah.
Most dentists, even the dentists that own a practice, when you talk about just they're building an asset, okay? Yeah. Which is, you have to consider that. But most of them they're getting paid basically just as a dentist, because like I said, the average overhead in a practice is 72%, yeah. Which means their 28% is profit, which is less than an associate. But if you can improve these subtle nuances, yeah. And I'm telling you, it is not big. It's small. If you can improve in these things in a small way, essentially you can make twice as much, and the other half is from owning the practice. And that's the income aspect. Yeah. Not only are you doing that from the income aspect, but you've taken an asset that used to be worth, a certain quantity, and you've increased that also significantly.
Because it's more profitable. It's a better business, not only just sheer production, but also the profitability of that business.
Absolutely. You've made your asset more valuable, as well as your income be significantly higher. And you can control that when you own a practice. Now, if you don't make it any more valuable, and if you do not even improve the financial situation, you are still building up an asset. And the production and the collections in that practice is paying for that asset for you. And so you'll still have something at the end, but along the way, you can make it so much better, so much better.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to kind of wrap this up, because we don't have any sort of affiliate relationship. I'm not getting any kickbacks from Dental Intel. I'm just a big fan of you guys and what you've done. I've heard you on other podcasts. I heard you in person lecture twice, and we've had some really good conversations. But the thing that you are doing that I just love is giving practice owners the tools to improve themselves, and giving their staff the tools to improve themselves and their capacity and ability to serve patients and do more dentistry, lowering that barrier to entry on practice ownership, and then on getting out this extra value out of that practice, that last bump in production, that last bump in tweaking these little levers. You're giving people the tools to run their business and run their practice at the capacity and potential of what it could be. And so this has been really good. Thank you so much for being on the show. Yeah. Any final points to drive things home?
And one thing I do want to point out is we've talked about a lot of things that people who are listening may feel like they're complex. And I wanted to be able to explain some of these things in detail so you could go figure out and calculate these things on your own.
Yeah.
And you can do that. People that use our software, and the reason why they use our software is it does this for you. And it makes it simple, and it makes it easy, where you're not having to go and try to calculate all these things and figure it all out. It's all figured out for you, and it takes that data that's important and it hands it to you on a silver platter, so that you then are just now taking action on it instead of having to try to go figure it all out. So that's the main reason why people use our software. Now, a lot of these things you could go calculate on your own. And some of them, like I said, you'd have to do manually. And even if you had to calculate every single thing manually, I would encourage your listeners to do it because it will drive their performance. But if they want it to be super simple, where it just calculates these things for them and then serves up to them on a silver platter the things that they need to do, I'd recommend that they use Dental Intel.
Awesome. Well, if they want to reach out to Dental Intel, should they reach out to you? I mean, you're the president of the company. I know you are an extremely busy man. I don't want to throw a bunch of people at you, but what is the kind of best way for people to reach out to you guys? And do you have any resources that we could provide people? I don't know if you have, we should have talked about this beforehand, but if you have any presentations with kind of this data that we've talked about during the show.
We put a lot of videos on YouTube.
Okay.
And so anybody wants to go to YouTube and search for us, we talk about a lot of these topics as well as other topics about managing, using data to be able to drive action within your practice. You can go there, find those things, look to our website as well. Best thing that I would say to do is go to our website. You can fill out for a free snapshot. If you own a practice and you want to take a look at your data and have us go over it with you and talk about these types of things and help point out some things to you, go to our website, fill out for that free snapshot of your practice, and we'll facilitate that and take care of that for you. If you're looking to acquire a practice, I would recommend go do the same thing. And in the notes, let us know that you're looking to acquire a practice, and I'll let our people know that they should probably be expecting some of those. If you want to call us, you can give us a call as well. Our phone number, I was going to tell you our toll-free number, but I don't know what it is. Yeah. Our number is 801-717-2777. And if when you call in, if you want to ask for me personally and you listen to this podcast and you had some questions on any of the things, feel free to ask for me and I'll do what I can in talking with you and answering your questions.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And I'm going to caution our listeners, definitely reach out to them. If you're looking at an acquisition, I wouldn't bother them unless this is like something like you're doing the due diligence. That's when I would bring them in, not like, oh, hey, I've got these 7 practices that I'm looking at potentially. Can you analyze all of them? That would be asking a little bit much, but you've been extremely generous to offer your time to be on the show. And then to offer that to our listeners. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, Rob, for coming on. Okay, George.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
You were to have a dental buddy that you could just geek out with, like who better than Rob Bay?
Yeah, it was awesome for me because if you ever think about, something that you really understand really well, when you look at it from a different perspective, you ask yourself, do I still understand that stuff when it's approached from a different angle? And that's what I felt like a lot of this interview was, because Rob was mentioning a lot of metrics that he uses in his software that you don't necessarily have when you're looking at a practice. So I think it really is a good test for your understanding. If you understood what he was talking about, then you have a good grasp on the things that we've been talking about on the podcast, because we talk about everything that he said in a different way. And I thought that was really cool to hear him talk about everything using his metrics and his software. But these are all concepts that we've touched on. And I thought that was really awesome to see it from a totally different angle, but looking at the same thing.
No, absolutely. And it's like when you study for a test and you think you know how the teacher is going to test, and then they test a different way, but you studied enough that you're good enough and you can figure it out and like move forward on the test. Why am I bringing up a testing analogy? That's awful. Ugh.
Yeah, Richard, this is a fun podcast. This is
okay. So this was an awesome episode. I had a blast. I actually caught myself doing what one of the early pieces of advice I gave to you as a podcast host. I was like, make sure to not cut off the guest with like the answer that they're getting to. Like, let them deliver the punchline. And like, I think listening back, like I kind of like got excited and like delivered his punchline a couple times. So I'm gonna have to apologize to him for that. But I was so into it. So this is great. So let's go into some of these specifics. And you said people aren't going to have these numbers when they're looking at a typical listing and dealing with a broker. So how can we dive in and get some of this metrics or create some of these metrics for ourselves when it's not handed to us on a plate? So what are some examples that you have?
Well, I want to talk about So this section, a lot of this section is the 8th section of the Ownership Accelerator, analyzing an opportunity. And what we talk about is assessing all of these things that he talked about and all the things you should be looking at in relation to what you're actually going to be having when you look at a listing. Like I mentioned in the intro, Rob is able to in order for him to do an analysis, he has to have access to the practice's software. And a lot of times when you're looking at listings, you're limited in the amount of information you have.
Sure.
And so I like to only do things with information that is very applicable. So like he has production per visit, and that's something he measures. And he talks about like the number of patient visits per year, and he talks about increasing the amount of revenue per patient visit. And for me, the way I look at that is that's really internal growth. You're looking at increasing your collections based on the same number of patients. So you're looking at things like keeping procedures in-house. So you'd be looking at the amount of procedures that are referred out. You can look at that in the production by provider report by ADA code to see what procedures are being done, which ones are not. And then you can look at, he talks about like the reproducibility of the production. So he talks about if a dentist is doing $1,000 per patient visit, that's not a very reproducible practice. The way we would look at that is we would say, okay, well, the crown to 3 to 4 surface filling ratio is very high. A lot of crowns are being done for a few amount of fillings. The hygiene percentage is low, and there are a lot of specialty procedures, maybe some implants, something that you don't do clinically. That would be our way of assessing if it's reproducible or not, versus he's looking at the production per patient visit.
Sure.
So it's metrics that he has that we don't. And so you have to find in the pro formas and those things you're looking at, how do you get that information? And so for the internal growth, those increase in the revenue per patient, I really think of Derek Williams' acquisition because he bought that practice and like overnight grew 80%. And a lot of that was because, just diagnostically, he was a lot different than the seller, and that's a great way to get immediate growth in a practice, is buying an opportunity like that that's really maybe underperforming. So that's something Rob talks about, but just in a different light. You kind of see what I mean?
Yeah, well, and it's like, if you ask a broker, can you give me like the revenue per patient or like the production per visit? They're probably going to scratch their head and look at you like, like you can kind of figure that out, but like, how's that going to help you? And it's just, they don't have the number of visits that they can easily, in a given month kind of divide by the production, all of that. So what do you feel like? So we've discussed this from that aspect, but like, what are some other ways that we can take what he talked about today? Like he talked about operatories and the physical capacity. So do you feel like that was a more relevant, or not relevant, but a digestible metric that we could use?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love that one where he said, so I wrote it down so everyone remembers, because it kind of came in the middle. So if you didn't have time here's a little review. So he takes a number of ops in the practice and times that by the number of 8-hour days.
Okay.
Times just some standard number, $75,000. And that is like the physical capacity. So the most revenue you could really expect to do with the number of operatories and days of week where you open. So the example in the episode was he was open 5 days a week, 5 operatories with 4 days a week of 8-hour days, and times 75,000, it's about $1.5 million as like your upper capacity. So I think one way to look at that is if you're looking at a practice and you want a practice of a specific size, you can use that formula to figure out, is this practice's facility sufficient for me and my goals? And I really liked that metric. That was probably my favorite thing that he talked about in the whole episode, was that specific metric that you can use to estimate the capacity of a facility.
Well, and it's kind of cool because you can expand the capacity in multiple ways. It's like, if they had the room to add an operatory, you could add an operatory. Or if you wanted to work an extra day or a day less, or bring in an associate and have them work a certain number of days, you have that formula allows you to kind of tweak it at different points, so that you're not just locked in. I mean, if you have only 4 operatories, you are locked into that part of the equation, but you could add days per week that the practice is open, to kind of overcome that physical capacity to a certain point. So I thought that was a pretty unique perspective on that.
Yeah. And I thought that, that in of itself was really insightful from Rob, and it shows the analysis that they can do on an existing practice. I thought that was also very impressive, the amount of things that you can do. One thing I wanted to talk about is he kind of talks about, your clinical income income that you're paying yourself, for doing the dentistry, and that, we talk about that as
Sure.
like your doctor's salary, and it talks about the income from owning the practice as your EBITDA that we talk about on the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And then he talks about break-even point, which is like one of my favorite financial metrics.
We've talked about that too much?
We haven't talked about it really at all. And then it came up in Tanner's episode. It was like last episode, maybe the one before it. We talked about break-even point. And that's a big reason why when we talk about your fixed costs, when you're looking at a practice to purchase, like your staff and your facility, we really harp on those are the most important to keep low, because then your break-even point and extreme profitability comes sooner. And that's something that, I don't think we maybe articulated well enough. So I thought that his discussion about that probably was a good time to talk about that here, where you have 38% of your, cost or less should be staff and facility. It shouldn't be more than 38% when you're looking to buy a practice, because that'll make it a lot harder to be super profitable, like you talked about.
Well, and I think it also goes back to like the power of software like Dental Intel, in that it's going to help you understand your break-even point, not just overall, but like on a day-to-day basis. Like it's an important number to know scheduling wise, because it's like if you have 2 days a week where you don't schedule a lot of heavy procedures, you're just maybe doing some exams and a few light things. Like if you know your break-even point for that day is, X $1,000 and you aren't producing that much in those 2 days, then you shouldn't have your doors open those days. And then also at the same time, if you can crush that before lunch and you know that everything after lunch is all profit, it's a confidence booster, and you can more confidently set goals for your team and bonuses if you choose to do things like that with that knowledge. So it's something that I bet a lot of people don't know it on a daily basis, and they don't know if it's changed or gone up or down. And if you have the software, it's going to tell you this is what your current break-even point is, and is going to factor in all of that and include those fixed costs and average them out over the days that you're open and give you that information.
That was awesome. Yeah, absolutely. I think we should just leave it at that.
Cool. Well, I love this. I can't wait to have Rob back on the show.